a group of men who like to go out every year on an annual deer hunting trip. And as was often the case, they got together in the last year and they got out there before the day of opening season. They got their camp set up, got ready to go. And when opening day came, before the sun was even up, they were headed out onto the hillside to try to find their dream animal out there. And over the course of the day, as they went out, each of them broke up into pairs to go hunt together. So they had a friend with them in case they needed help. And so over the course of the day, each of the pairs came back to the campsite with varied luck in terms of how their trip went. And they sat down around the campfire. And as the evening started to wear on, they started to get concerned because two of the guys that were out hunting still hadn't returned yet. And so as they waited around the campfire concerned, one of them finally stumbled into the camp looking exhausted. And he had a beautiful trophy buck that he was carrying on his shoulder as he came into camp. And everybody awed at the giant animal. And they stopped for a second and said, "Hey, where's Harry at?" And the guy said, "Oh, man, see, he had a stroke about halfway up the hill." And so they said, "You just left him on the hill?" And he said, "Well, I wasn't worried about somebody trying to steal him." So I use that story to tell you, sometimes in our lives, we do not properly prioritize things, right? Maybe you've been there. Maybe you've been in that embarrassing moment where you had to choose between two things and you thought, "I got it." And then you found out, "Oh my goodness, that was not the right choice. I definitely should have chose differently." Today we're going to see that bore out in the book of Genesis as we continue our study of that book. If you have your Bible today, I want to encourage you to grab them and open them up to Genesis chapter 25. If you don't have a Bible with you, you can grab one from the seat in front of you. If you're using that Bible, it'll look just like this one. If you're using that Bible, we are actually going to be on page 24 today. So feel free to turn through to there. I think we got the wrong chapter on the screen, but actually it's the right page number. So if you're using the Pew Bible. So I want to encourage you to turn your way there. Just as a reminder, this Genesis series we call Identity Lost and Found, and we're talking about how God is showing us the life of Abraham and the patriarchs, the founders of the nation of Israel. And all of this is being revealed about 400 years later to Moses as he has led the people of God out of slavery in Egypt. And they're coming out of the slavery and they're trying to figure out, what do our lives look like? Who are we? Where did we come from? Why are we here? What are we supposed to accomplish in our life? And for that matter, how are we supposed to accomplish it? And those are all really big picture questions, which incidentally, they're questions all of us should ask at some point in our own life. And so as we walk through this, we've been able to see many answers to that. And today we're going to add another principle to that. And I'll say the answers were directed towards the nation of Israel at that time around 1450 BC, but they still are equally applicable to us today. The truths that are here can be meaningful for us as well. And so we're going to dig into that passage. Let me also just mention before we begin reading today that the first half of our passage is actually going to be genealogy. And that's important for two reasons. Number one, we're going to find some pretty interesting facts as we walk through it that will just shed some light on some eternal truths. But also, in the book of Genesis, whenever we see a genealogy, typically that's a place marker to tell us that we're moving to another major movement in the passage. And so we'll actually at the beginning talk about the death of Abraham. And today we're going to make the complete transition. We made a partial transition earlier away from the life of Abraham to that of his son Isaac. Now, today, we're going to completely move away from Abraham to the life of Isaac and Jacob and Esau, his children, and even those children who come afterwards. So we're continuing forward in the narrative. This is a great starting point if you're joining us for the first time today to continue on that journey with us. So we'll begin with verses 1 through 6 in chapter 25. But before we do, I'll ask you to take a moment right now and join me for a moment of prayer. Heavenly Father, we have a whole lot of things that distract and redirect us in this life. And man, I'm embarrassed at the number of times I should have been doing something for you and I was instead watching my TV or lost in my own thoughts. I pray today that in these moments you would draw our attention to you. Help us to see you more clearly and through that to see ourselves the way you see us. Father, if we have priorities that are awry today, if we've left someone on the trail, pray you'd help us to backtrack and get this straightened out. I pray this in Christ's name, Lord. Amen. Okay, so chapter 25, verses 1 through 6. I'll warn you too, we're going to have some doozies in terms of names today, so bear with me. Abraham had taken another wife, whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimram, Jokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan was the father of Sheba and Dedan. The descendants of Dedan were the Asherites, the Lutishites, and the Lumites. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, and Eldah. All these were descendants of Keturah. Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac, but while he was still living, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them away from his son Isaac to the land of the east. All right, so an interesting note here. First of all, we see that there is an additional concubine. Now, let me just say, when I say the word concubine, I think in the modern context, we often have our minds immediately go to prostitute. That's not actually what was happening here in the ancient world. For wealthy men who often practiced polygamous relationships, so you could have multiple full-bore wives, or there was a lower office of wife. It still was legally binding. You still had to care for her and her children after her. But that title is the word we translate as concubine into our English language. And so Abraham here has taken on a third wife. We've already seen in the past where Abraham and Sarah was Abraham's original wife. God had promised they would form a nation, that he would have an offspring from him that did that. But after a few decades of waiting, Sarah became desperate and thought, this is never going to happen. I don't know what God's doing, but he doesn't seem to be doing anything right now. And so she encouraged Abraham to take her handmaiden Hagar and to have a child with her. Abraham was weak and did so, and as a result of that, their child Ishmael was born, and Ishmael lived with Abraham into his adulthood. But later, as Isaac came on the scene, hostility built in that relationship, and God instructed Abraham that Hagar and Ishmael needed to leave because he would take care of them in their future, and they would still have a nation that came from them, but because Isaac was the child of promise. Isaac was the one that the nation of Israel would ultimately come through, and the Messiah would ultimately come through. Now, as we start today, we hear about Keturah. Incidentally, Keturah's name means pleasant aroma or spice, and that's interesting to me in part because our coffee, our church house brand coffee, is actually made by a roaster called Keturah Coffee, and it smells decent, so there's that. But I guess that part carries through. But Keturah and Abraham get married. Now, I'll say, one thing we're not totally clear on is, do they get married while Sarah's still alive, or is it after her death? A few chapters ago, we saw her passing, and I'd like to think it's after her passing that this happens. But I will just mention, we're going to see some of the things that happen in today's chapter happening out of chronological order. They're going to go in order of category, what regards one person's life, as opposed to chronology, exactly how things happen in order. So it is possible this may have happened while Sarah was still alive. Again, I'd like to think not, but we don't know with certainty based on the passage. But Keturah, as we see, has many children. You might wonder, why bother to name out all these children? Well, a few reasons. Number one, they are still offspring of Abraham, who's going to be used in this important way. But also, many of these children and their children will actually intermarry with the descendants of Isaac, and for that matter, the descendants of Ishmael too. In fact, Ishmael's descendants we'll talk about later, and they also will be intermarrying with God's people in the future. And so it's important we hear it now, because this will show that they're often marrying people who are their distant cousins or something like that still have that similar religious background, and also who are of the same sort of people. So I want to point out, when we get to verse 6 is where things, or verse 5 is where things change a bit. It says, Abraham left all of his assets, he left all of his property to Isaac, but it gives us an exception to that. But while he was still living, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines. So we have to speculate on what this looks like, but it seems likely, first of all, good to note that Abraham, we're told, and many historians agree, Abraham is probably the richest individual on earth at this point in time. So he's exceedingly wealthy, and we don't know exactly what the gifts are, but I think this is pointing out to us, he didn't simply abandon these children. So, for example, if Abraham had over $1 billion net worth, and he went up to these, several kids of Keturah, and he said, hey, here's 10 million for you, here's 10 million for you, here's 10 million for you. Could you live off of that? Could you get by with $10 million? I'd say you could build a pretty good life. I'd love to try to get by on $10 million. That'd be fun to try. But for most of us, right, we've never even seen that amount of money. But he can give lavish gifts to each of them, and it is a lot. It's enough that they can go off and they can buy a farm and get married and start a life and have a very great launching point for everything that happens next. But it might seem like only a little bit when you hear that to the son Isaac, he got the $1 billion check. Now, they obviously didn't have checks, but you guys get the idea. There's a more substantial inheritance that's being kept for Isaac, and that's because Isaac is the child of promise who ultimately this messianic promise is going to come through, that Jesus is going to come through him, but also who the nation of Israel that's going to ultimately create that offspring and be a special people that God has a distinct relationship. They're going to come through that as well. Now we're going to continue and hear about the death of Abraham himself. So let's pick back up at verse 7. Abraham lived 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man full of years, and he was gathered to his people. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah near Mamre in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite. The field Abraham had bought from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried with his wife Sarah. After Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who then lived near Beer Lahai Roi. All right, so Abraham has a very full life. We see post-flood that some of these individuals are still having longer than average generations of life. Nowadays it's pretty well capped out at around 120 if you're really long-lived, and that would be exceptional length of life. But back then, post-flood, there were still some of these longer lifespans. And so Abraham ends up with a 175-year lifespan. That's pretty substantial. And it really gives us a favorable look at what the death of Abraham looked like. You notice verse 8, it says he breathed his last breath. That seems to imply a gentle death of natural causes, that he died at a good old age, an old man full of years, so he had a full and fulfilling life. Think about everything Abraham did in his life. He was involved in epic battles and wars. He was involved in geopolitics that defined a region. He went from having nothing to having a tremendous amount of wealth by God's blessing. He had his wife, who he loved so deeply, and he had his concubines, which made life interesting, if nothing else, I guess. And still loved those kids too. And so a full life here has been had. And notice the next part, though. It says, and he was gathered to his people. There are many liberal scholars in the modern world who like to say that the idea of heaven and hell weren't present in the Old Testament. And I want to point out, if you believe that, you really have to put a spin on a lot of different passages in the Old Testament, and this is one of them. Here it says that he actually went to go be with his family when he died, which has some interesting implications for us about heaven. That Abraham, being faithful to God, and though he made mistakes, though he was imperfect, certainly, ultimately, his loyalties were to God. And they give us this sense that when Abraham dies, he's going to be going up to heaven. And I can't help but think, maybe Sarah is waiting there to welcome him and show him around, show him what the landscape looks like. And he may have seen his father, Terah, there, or even seen his grandfather there. All of these different family members and loved ones who also had shared in this journey of following Yahweh and had him at the center of their lives, all coming together and joining together in heaven. It creates a beautiful image of the afterlife. And I'll say, too, this image of the afterlife is actually affirmed in the New Testament. Jesus Christ tells the account of a rich man and a gentleman named Lazarus. And the basics of the story are that there's this impoverished Jewish believer named Lazarus, and he's down on his luck, he's in really rough shape, and he's laying out starving to death on the doorstep of this wealthy man. And the purple garments this wealthy man wore leads you to think maybe he's even a priest, or he's certainly some sort of royal lineage to have that color of clothing. That was the most expensive dye you could get. Typically, priestly or royal people wore it. And so out there on his doorstep, Lazarus is starving to death, and Jesus is clear. This guy would not even offer Lazarus the table scraps he fed his dogs. He just left this dude who was part of his church, part of his faith, and who was one of his countrymen out here to die on his doorstep. And Jesus says, some people call this a parable, but actually it seems like Jesus is giving a real-world account here. Jesus says that when the two men died, that the wealthy man ended up in hell, suffering torment there, but that Lazarus ended up in heaven being comforted at Abraham's bosom, being pulled into Abraham's side and comforted by him. So again, this is painting this picture that for the Jewish people and presumably for us as well, that when we die, not only will we get to see people that we love, who love Jesus, who went before us, and have community and connection with them again, but also we're going to get to see the heroes of the faith. We'll get to see people like Moses and Abraham, and we can ask him then, hey, was this Keturah thing before or after Sarah? We can get some clarification on some of these questions that we want to know about. But it's this beautiful image of what's going to happen. And meanwhile, on earth, while Abraham is passing into a new eternal life, on earth we see that in a beautiful image, we have Isaac and his brother who are coming together, Hagar, son Ishmael, and they are coming together to do the burial service for their father. And so these two have been at war with each other at various points. They've been at odds with one another, and yet here they are. As they've grown older, it seems as if they've made peace. And so they realize, you know what? If there's something that can get us together, ought to get us together, it's Dad's passing. We can be together for that, and we can renew our friendship for that. And so they come and they bring his remains to the cave of Machpelah. That's a cave that he bought specifically to bury his wife at. It's actually the only piece of land Abraham will ever buy in his lifetime. It's interesting because he knows his descendants will eventually be taken into captivity in Egypt. God's prophesied that to him, so he doesn't buy a bunch of land except for this place. He knows, hey, we will want a place, though, where we can mourn our dead and think about our lost loved ones. And this was the same place where we found Abraham grieving over the body of Sarah when she passed, and now she's in turn there, and his physical body is joining her here on earth, and his eternal soul is joining her up in heaven at the same time. So a beautiful image of the afterlife and what's happening there. The final verse of this section, verse 11, is interesting, and we could miss it real easily if we skip past it. But it says, after Abraham's death, God blessed his son Isaac, who then lived near Beer Lahai Roi. Well, Beer Lahai Roi is a site we've heard about twice in Genesis so far. The first time that Hagar, Abraham's first concubine, that she fled, she had been poking and chiding Sarah, and then Sarah went back at her even worse, and so then she fled, not even knowing not even knowing the future of her child, but she fled and took off into the desert. And while she was fleeing from Abraham, she got several days away, and she stopped in desperation, not knowing what to do. And God came to her and met her and told her, hey, you need to go back to Abraham. I'm going to take care of you and your son. And in fact, he added to this, your son is actually going to end up having a nation that comes from him. Part of the promise I gave to Abraham and Sarah, I'm going to extend that to you as a blessing. So go back, make peace, and do that. And she called the place that she was at, the well that she was at, Beer Lahai Roi, which means the well of the God who sees me. This is a place where she encountered the real God for the first time. And she was Egyptian, so she probably had grown up praising the fake gods of Egypt. Now there's this real living God who came and actually sent an angel and talked to her, or maybe even Jesus himself and talked to her. And so she returns back. This is also right at the end of the last chapter, the very meeting place where Isaac is going to, for the first time, meet Rebekah. And so I think it's kind of neat that he's coming back and they're ultimately going to settle and they're going to build their life together at that very spot where they first met each other, where this bride promised to Isaac that God had prepared and done supernatural steps to get to him, who he fell so deeply in love with. Now they together are going to live in the same region where they met, where their romance started, and God brought them together for the first time. So they begin that life. Now next we're going to look at some of the descendants of Ishmael. Then we'll get to the main focus part of our passage. Let's continue at verse 12. This is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Ishmael, whom Sarah's slave Hagar, the Egyptian, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael, listed in order of their birth. Nebaioth, the firstborn of Ishmael, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mishnah, Duma, Massa, Hadad, Tema, Jetur, Naphish, and Kedemah. These were the sons of Ishmael, and these are the names of the 12 tribal rulers, according to their settlements and camps. Ishmael lived 137 years. He breathed his last and died, and he was gathered to his people. His descendants settled in the area from Havilah to Shur, near the eastern border of Egypt, as you go towards Asher. And they lived in hostility towards all the tribes related to them. Well, I'll tell you what, that last sentence isn't something you'd want said of your family, is it? everybody they were connected with, they were in hostility with them. Interestingly, this passage really harkens back to that initial promise, I believe it's in chapter 15, that Hagar got regarding Ishmael. She heard on the good side, hey, I'm going to build a nation out of him. I'm going to take care of both of you. But on the other side of that, she heard also, he is going to be a donkey of a man. He's going to be constantly kicking at the people in his life, even people who love him. And so there's going to be some brokenness there. And yet, this has come. This is showing that so much of what God promised has come true in some good and even in some bad ways. He's had 12 children. There are 12 tribes that come off of him, similar to what will happen with Jacob ultimately. And those families have become prominent. They have their own land. They have their own assets. God's given them material wealth. And yet at the same time, the sad part is that they're actually at war with each other in the midst of that. Now, interestingly, in that passage, it says that Ishmael died, verse 17, and he breathed his last, and he was gathered to his people. So it seems like whatever brokenness Ishmael had in his life, before he passed away, he must have sorted that out, because he is going up to heaven as well. He's headed in that same direction. The sad part is, Ishmael had this brokenness, and he didn't solve it until the end of his life. And so now here his kids are left with those lessons that their young father taught them. And it's lessons like, hey, we should really go after each other and hate each other. There's a sad truth to that sometimes you don't leave the legacy you intend to as your sin enters the lives of people you love. We tend to think my decisions are about me, but actually this passage is illustrating it's a lot more than that. Now, I just want to mention, we've talked about two different concubines that Abraham had, and I just want to point out as we talk about this, that we're obviously seeing polygamy here, but I want you to note, nowhere in this passage does it ever say God told Abraham to marry Keturah or God told Abraham to marry Hagar. So whenever we see this in the Bible, it's never because God said, hey, this is exactly what you should do, jump in and do this. We see it because people were doing their own thing. And that doesn't mean they go to hell for it, but it means it introduced a lot of brokenness in their lives. And we've already seen that certainly through Hagar and Sarah and their interactions. And boy, fasten your seatbelts, because when we get to the life of Jacob, we're going to see that 10 times over. We're going to see all kinds of drama because we decided we were going to have a whole bunch of wives, and this is going to be a brilliant idea. So just want to be clear, this is not a prescription from the Bible, but it's them noting this was a common thing in the ancient world, and Abraham indulged in that same thing, and yet God still took care of him and still took care of his descendants, although there was no shortage of brokenness amongst them as they lived through that. All right, let's move on now to Isaac and to his offspring, and really to the main thrust of our passage here, picking up at verse 19. This is the account of the family line of Abraham's son Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean from Paddan Aram, and sister of Laban the Aramean. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord, and the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two people from within you will be separated. One will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. So they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out, with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. So if you note that last verse, we find out Isaac's age at the birth of the children was 60, and we saw at the beginning of the passage he got married at 40. So that gives us a timeline for this. Isaac and Rebekah, our last chapter, gave us the whole account of this. God did a bunch of miracles to bring them together. But now they're married, and for 20 years, they're waiting. And they're waiting to have a kid, and they fully expect that they will, because God handpicked this woman to be with this man. It was obvious from all the miracles that were done in the process. And yet, and with that, God had promised, hey, you guys someday are going to have a great nation coming from you. And yet, Rebekah and Isaac are struggling with the very same thing that Sarah and Abraham had struggled with infertility. And in fact, actually to carry that forward, we'll see this happen again down the line with Rachel and with Jacob. They're going to have similar issues. And so a natural question might be, hey, why does God allow this to happen? What's going on here? And let me just say, with brokenness in the world like this, first and foremost, we live in a fallen world. In our hearts, we know that health issues like this really aren't the way it's supposed to be, and that's because we were designed to live in Eden. And yet, you and I made sinful decisions in our life, and in doing so, we broke not only our relationship with God, but we broke creation itself. And so now, natural disasters and disease and death are a part of this creation, and sometimes they come in and they touch our lives in some unfortunate ways. So on its face, pain and suffering are part of the picture because of the evil that we've allowed to flow into this world, and those who came before us have as well. But beyond that, in this instance, there's actually another special reason, I think, as to what's going on. When Sarah conceived Isaac at age 90, was there any way that happened other than a miracle? No. You can't find a modern account of something like that happening. It doesn't occur. In fact, you can find people in their 80s, as late as their 80s, who have, but that was with in vitro fertilization. There's nothing like that happening. And it's not as if Isaac and Rebekah have not been trying for that. You can bet they've been married 20 years. They're very in love with each other. They no doubt have gone through the biological process by which children are conceived many times. And yet, 20 years in, we're not there. There's no children. And so we see some interesting indications for the character of Isaac and for his wife in what happens next. First of all, notice Isaac, he trusts in God, and so he goes to the Lord and says, God, please, my poor wife, we've been trying so long, she feels terrible. Can you please bless her with a kid? And by the way, you did promise someday she'd have one, so there's that. And in Isaac crying out to the Lord, loving his wife enough to pray on behalf of her, God answers that. Hey, let me ask you real quick, husbands in the room, when was the last time you prayed for your wives? When was the last time you actually got down on your knees and lifted her up before God? That would be a good thing to do, wouldn't it? Like Isaac set a good example for us. So he comes and lifts up Rebekah to the Lord. It says, God, you got to help us here. My wife's heartbroken, and you promised us this future. And so, maybe normally we couldn't expect this as a default thing, but here we're hoping to. And so God blesses them, and they're not only pregnant, but they're doubly pregnant. She's pregnant with twins. And then notice, all of a sudden, there's a cage match happening in Rebekah's stomach, and she's not sure what's happening. There's no ultrasound, so she can't tell if she's got twins or triplets or quintuplets or just one baby who's really destructive. Maybe it's a Tasmanian devil in her womb or something. But so she's not sure what's going on, but now she steps up and she comes before the Lord and asks him for guidance. She actually is audacious enough to say, God, boy, if you could give me some answers, I would really appreciate that. Now, part of why I point out both of these people seeking God in this is that with the brokenness that we're going to read about in the next few chapters, it's natural for us to ask ourselves, hey, are Isaac and Rebekah actually devout followers of God? And we're going to see some brokenness on their behalf, just like we see some brokenness on our own behalves. But in this passage, we can see when things go wrong and when there's troubles and trials, both of these people are quick to call out to God. That's a good sign for where their faith is with him. And God does not disappoint with Rebekah. He gives her some very valuable information. She asks, why is this happening to me? In verse 23, the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 people from within you will be separated. Now, what is being said, the 2 parts of this prophecy that God is sharing, is going to relate to the birth of these children, their time in the womb, the entirety of their lives, and it's actually even foreshadowing for what will happen for generations ahead. We're going to see children battling each other, and in fact, we've seen that happen in the past, even looking at Cain and Abel and the children of Noah and different fights that have happened. This isn't the first time there's been contention between kids. But God is saying, hey, there's actually going to be 2 children in there, but these 2 children are ultimately going to be 2 boys who make out 2 nations. And they will be divided from each other. Now, again, we'll see that at birth because, as we read, Jacob is grabbing onto Esau's ankle as if trying to pull him back in and say, no, I'm first, get back here. And so they literally have to be pried apart when they're born. But even later in their life, Jacob is going to have to flee and go to Laban because of the hostilities and because Esau, it explicitly says, is wanting to kill him. He wants to murder him for what Jacob has done. And I'll say, related to this, as we go forward, both of these young men, although their parents seem to be believers, we don't actually see any indicators either Esau or Jacob are believers themselves until much later in this narrative. And so at this moment, they really haven't owned that faith themselves. In fact, Jacob, when he talks about God in the future, he's going to say, my father's God. He'll call about his father's God instead of his God. He won't personally claim him. But God's second part of that prophecy is that one people, so one nation coming from these two, will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. So out of these two different nations, there's actually going to be a distinction between them. And normally you'd expect the older brother to be the stronger one who had the authority. But God's saying here, actually, the younger son is going to take that position, and that will carry forward in the nations that they bear. That's particularly interesting because right now, as the Israelites are receiving this in Moses' presence, and they're getting ready to go into the Promised Land, one of the first nations they're going to encounter in the Promised Land is the Edomites. And so they now know, hey, those are our kinfolk. Those people are actually related to us. And God's going to specifically say, because these are descendants of your father Abraham and your father Isaac, I want you to go through there and be peaceful as you make that. I don't want you to be at war with them. But to be clear, they will in the future. The Edomites will eventually become a thorn in the side of the Israelites moving forward. So we have that prophecy set out, and this is going to define the relationship of these two boys and what's going to happen next. And I do want to point out as well, the book of Romans talks about this event and points out that, first of all, God is not saying who's going to heaven and who's going to hell. He's talking about the special role he's going to have for each of these people's lives. And so even though they're not born yet, God's already saying, you know what, Jacob, I'm going to use him in a special way. Esau, there'll be a nation from him too, but he's not going to be the one the Messiah comes through. So God being God, he's able to make those decisions. Maybe he's seeing and anticipating the character that these people are going to have in the future, but he's already made that call. Now, at the birth, it's pretty interesting because Esau comes out first, and Esau's got a red complexion, and he is covered like a bear in hair, and it's red hair. And so the word Esau actually sounds very similar to the word Edom, at least that's our English transliteration of those words. And so they nearly rhyme with each other in the Hebrew. And so because he's so red and has red all around him, they're just like, okay, we're going to call that kid Red. In fact, he'll have the nickname, we'll find out later, of Red. They'll even just call him that directly. So Esau is born, and as Esau comes out, again, Jacob is grasping onto his heel as if he's trying to yank him back in there so he can be the first one to get out. So they're already at competition with one another. And so they name him Jacob, and Jacob, the word Jacob and the word heel sound very similar to one another. So there's a play on words that we aren't able to read as clearly in the English. But it's also interesting because in the Hebrew language, there is a figure of speech for one who grasps at the heel. And that means that if you're somebody who grasps at the heel, then you're a trickster or a deceiver or a con man. And so, ironically, there's also that connotation attaching itself to Jacob, and we're very much going to see that bear out in his early life. He's going to live in that sort of way. So all of this is foreshadowing for what's going to happen in the time ahead in their lives. But both boys are born, they're healthy. I do just want to mention briefly, too, if we look at the ages of all of them, we can also deduce that at the point of these two boys' birth, Abraham would be 160 years old. Because we know Isaac's age, we can then compare it to Abraham's age. So for 15 years of their life, they will actually, into what in the ancient world would be considered their adulthood, they'll actually be growing up with their grandpa right there in their camp. So I think that's cool too, and it'll be relevant in the moment ahead because they can ask him questions. He can tell them. You can bet Grandpa Abraham told them stories about, look at all God did to bring us out of the land we were in. Look at what he did to save us time and time again. Hey, let me tell you the story about my brother or my cousin Lot when he got kidnapped. And so all of these tales, I'm sure, are told to these two young men in their youth. And again, we're sort of out of the chronology, but we're talking about it categorically. And I think that's fun to think of, that these two got to actually know their grandpa some before they passed, or before he passed. All right, let's read the final section, verse 27. The boys grew up, and Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was content to stay at home among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once, when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." That is why he is also called Edom. Jacob replied, "But first sell me your birthright." "Look, I'm about to die," Esau said. "What good is a birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank, and then got up and left. So Esau despised his birthright. All right. So interesting events unfold here. First, the stage is set, and this will matter even more in our next chapter. But we see that there's some favorites going on. By the way, did your parents have favorites? Did they have one sibling they liked over the others? You can write it on your connection card if you want to. Who was the favorite kid in the family? If mom's sitting next to you, maybe not now. Do it later. Well, she's not looking. But unless it's you, in which case, own it and be proud of it. But there can be that dynamic in families, right? And so it can be a thing. And in this case, it's very pronounced as a thing. Isaac loves wild game meat, and Esau is this manly man, outdoorsman, hunter. He's this worldly guy, and so he's constantly bagging and bringing home delicious treats for Isaac to have. And for Jacob's part, Jacob's more of a homebody. He likes to cook and be around the domestic things that are happening, and that's a big connection point between he and Rebekah, his mother. And so they're connecting with one another that way, and we definitely have a game of favorites going on here as things move forward. So Jacob seems to, and it's not explicitly said in the passage, but from what I can see, it seems like Jacob is trying to set up a situation where he can get this birthright from his brother. And before we dive into the exact story, I just want to mention that this birthright, being the firstborn, in our culture today, you might say, "Oh, I'm the firstborn," and it would just speak to the order you were born in. It wouldn't mean much more. But actually, firstborn was more than just a condition in that world. It was actually a specific title that you would get, like you might get the title of president or prince or something like that, because it came with certain rights and certain privileges and also certain responsibilities. And those varied from culture to culture, but generally there were some major bonuses that you might get. And so just to give you an example of that, as the Levitical law is passed down, as we look forward in the next few books of the Bible, Israel will have this all codified. And for the oldest son in a family, they'll actually count the number of kids. So let's imagine for a minute that their family had 4 kids. So if there were 4 children in that family, they would break up. Upon the parent's death, they would break the estate up into 5 portions. And the oldest child would actually get a double portion of the estate. They would get twice as much as their brothers and sisters, their brothers would get. The sisters would then marry into other families and get their inheritance that way. Now, there was a responsibility that came with that, though. If you were that oldest sibling and you ended up with that extra inheritance, you were also the nursing home for mom and dad when they got to that phase. And so you would be the one helping take care of them as they went into their older age years and had their struggles. You were the one responsible for that. And all I have to say, as I think about it, it's kind of funny. Depending on your relationship with your in-laws, you might really be cheering to be married to one of the younger kids, you never know. But there were those privileges that came with it. It was an official title and station. And so it's this official title that Jacob actually wants. And I'll say, too, there's precedence in the ancient world in several accounts of people purchasing that right from others. So we see, for example, in Babylonian literature, examples of a son going in and for the price of 3 sheep selling off his birthright. I think that's kind of interesting because if it took 3 sheep for someone in Babylon to buy that top rank, then really, for a bowl of bean soup, Jacob's doing pretty good here. He's driving a bargain. But Jacob intentionally waits. He waits for Esau to come back. And we don't know how many days Esau has been out hunting, but he's been chasing wild game all over the country. He's exhausted. He's probably ran out of food. And I don't know if you guys have ever been out and had a really long day of manual labor like that, but something happens in your stomach when that occurs, doesn't it? I remember years ago I went hiking with some friends out in the foothills of Idaho. My wife and I both did, and it was another married couple. We were backpacking out there, and it took us an hour to get up on the hill and about 4 hours of hiking, and all of us were foolish enough to not bring snacks. And so we got done with that. We drove another hour back home, and we got to our house. I made just really simple spaghetti, with some meat sauce, and it was strange because to all of us, that was the best tasting spaghetti we've ever had. I think it was just because we were so hungry after all that time. And I can't but think that's going on with Esau. He's coming out of this field. He's been gone for days. He's burned a lot of calories. He gets home, and Isaac's standing out there with the perfect bean stew. He might have even tested the recipe before on him. Hey, what do you think about this? Oh, it's the best you've ever had? Okay, I'm setting that one aside. And so he waits here, and he's got his red stew, and they make a special point of saying that the beans in this stew are red because there is a weird situation happening where the red guy with reddish skin and reddish hair, who's named red basically, or her name rhymes with red, wants the red soup. And so, a tale as old as time. Okay, maybe not. They laughed at it first service, guys. Here he wants this red stuff, and it even makes the editorial note of, this is why he is also called Edom. This is why his nickname is Edom, which, by the way, when we hear about the Edomites later, that word Edom means red, so it's the red people. It's sort of like Greenland. This is red land. So there was an ancient Redland. I bet you didn't know that. But his own people will be named after this. So he sees the stew. He's lusting after it. He's famished and hungry. And so he comes to Jacob and says, hey, man, give me some stew. And Jacob starts playing his game. Now, to be clear, what Jacob's doing here is not entirely moral. He's coercing his brother. If your brother is starving to death, give the man a bowl of soup already. You've got a whole cauldron of it. It's not going to cost you anything. It's not like he even had to buy the ingredients. He got them from Rich Daddy. And so we're okay here. We can share some soup. But instead, he holds out. And he says, oh, really? You want some soup? Well, how bad do you want it? And so he says, first, sell me your birthright. And Esau, being quite dramatic, says, oh, well, what good is a birthright if I'm going to starve to death? Now, maybe in your house that might be the case. Maybe one bowl of bean soup would truly be the only food you have around. But just remember the context here. These are children of the wealthiest man on earth. This guy owns thousands of sheep, thousands of cattle. He has thousands of servants who keep his operation running on a day-to-day basis. Do you actually think there's no one else who has food available in this entire encampment of Abraham? And especially for the oldest son of the guy who runs it. There's just no way. Guy can walk 50 feet and get a loaf of bread from anybody he wants, but he doesn't want that loaf of bread. He wants this soup, and so he's being dramatic. And Jacob pushes him. Even though he says, oh, what good is it? I'm starving. Well, you might say that was him consenting, but Jacob goes a step further and says, actually, man, until you put your hand on a Bible and swear, until you're ready to give me an oath saying, you can have my birthright. For this bowl of soup, I'm giving it to you, then we don't have a deal. Now, that would be a good moment for Esau to walk out and say, hey, I can find food elsewhere. We're okay. But he doesn't. He treats with contempt this gift that God had given him. He dishonors his family, and he makes the agreement, sure, fine, take it. I don't care. And so with that, he actually loses his birthright. In fact, our final verse there says he despises it. That is the author's understanding of what's happening here. God is telling Moses this was him hating the gift that God had given him. Put simply, his priorities are way out of whack. And to elaborate on that a little bit, we already discussed that Esau and Jacob both were alive for 15 years that Abraham was as well. So not only is he taking this important office and responsibility in his family and just throwing it out, but it's more than that, because God has been crystal clear that this is actually the family through whom I'm going to raise up a nation that's going to change the course of human history. And through that nation, I'm going to raise up a Messiah who's going to actually rescue the whole world. The entire world is going to be blessed through this person. And so God is doing this tremendous thing. In fact, the most important thing God's ever going to do in the course of human history, it's all starting right here. And he has an opportunity to be at the front end of it. But in his mind, he just says, actually, but bean soup sounds pretty good. Or we could do that. Let me ask you, have you been trading off important things in your life lately for bean soup? Do you have somebody left having a stroke back on the trail that you need to turn around and find? I'm concerned for us because I think as a people, we are prone to that kind of mistake. I want to read from you briefly before we drive home the final part of this application from the book of Hebrews, because the book of Hebrews actually speaks about and sort of editorializes this event that we're speaking about. So we're in Hebrews chapter 12. You don't have to turn there. I'll read it for you. We're in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 14. It says, make every effort to live in peace with everyone and to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. See that no one is sexually immoral or godless like Esau. For a single meal he sold his inheritance rights as the oldest son. Afterward, as you know, when he wanted to inherit this blessing, he was rejected, even though he sought the blessing with tears. He could not change what he has done. Hebrews points out, going forward, what the implications of this are. Esau misprioritizes. He makes a terrible mistake, and that terrible mistake forever impacts the course of his life. It gets to a point where there's no turning back. You wanted this at one point, but then you flippantly traded it off for a bowl of soup. And when your brother came and got your dad's blessing, you cried, and you were so angry you wanted to murder him, but you already let that boat leave. And I want to point out to you today, you might think that your misplaced priorities are just a matter of personal preference. They're a matter of whatever you want to do. But you need to understand that you are leaving behind God's special will and blessing in your life when you turn away from Him and your priorities. And if you catch it now, maybe this is the moment where God is trying to get your attention to say, hey, stop what you're doing, look at me, and the damage doesn't have to be deep. It doesn't have to be lasting. You don't have to have the scars on your face. But if you continue to ignore it, you may be in the place that godless Esau was, turning your back on God long enough that you have a really hard time turning back forward without some pain being involved in it. I want to suggest to you, I think for most of us, in our relationships, in our pursuit of good character and morality, that we all often are people of misplaced priorities. Far too often we have bean soup sitting in front of us. And yet the passage today tells us, actually, if we would just reorient right now and say, hey, actually, I'm not gonna swear that oath, Jacob. I'm not down. We're not doing that. I can get bread anywhere in this place. I'll be okay. I got to value what's eternal instead of what's temporary. If we did that today, our story could have a different ending. But if we delay too long, pain is going to be a big part of it. What bowl of beans is sitting in front of you today? And how can you this week take a step to hand that back off and to orient yourself in the right direction? Much is lost and won on priorities. We don't know the number of days we have on this earth. We need to make them count, because the time that really does count is eternity, and what you do here determines what happens there. I'm going to ask some of our leaders to come forward and lead us in our time of communion and offering. As they do, I'll ask you to join me for a moment of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you that you prioritized us, that you sent your only Son to die for us. He gave up everything so that we could have a chance to have a relationship with you. Lord, I pray you would help us to not have evil lives of twisted values and twisted direction. Help us to prioritize the things of you in the here and now. Father, we thank you for each breath you give us, and we pray today that in our hearts you would draw us near to you and give us eyes for you. Help us to have the courage to choose what is right and courageously pursue it. I pray this in Jesus Christ's name, Lord. Amen.